The night Anna Shepard walked into the Dusty Creek Saloon with a bruise on her cheek and a rope burn around her wrist, every man at the bar went quiet, and the only one who stood up was the one nobody expected. It was the autumn of 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was still a place where the law was more suggestion than certainty, where a man's word counted for more than a judge's ruling, and where women like Anna, young, without family, without money, without anyone to speak for them, often disappeared into the machinery of hard men and harder choices without so much as a whisper left behind. The dust came in from the east that evening, carried on a wind that smelled of sage and cattle, and something older than both, and the oil lamps inside the Dusty Creek flickered as the door opened, and Anna stepped through it wearing a calico dress that had once been blue, but had been washed so many times it had surrendered its color to something between gray and regret. She was 22 years old. She had dark hair that she wore pinned back at the base of her neck, because she had learned early that loose hair drew the wrong kind of attention. Her eyes were the color of good creek water, that particular shade of green-brown that only appears in places where something is both clean and deep. She was not a woman who had been given much softness in her life, and it showed in the way she held her shoulders, slightly forward, slightly braced, as though she had grown accustomed to impact. The saloon was not a grand establishment. It had 12 tables, a bar made of pine that had warped in the summer heat and never quite straightened again, and a mirror behind the bottles that had a crack running through it from the lower left corner to the upper right, so that every reflection in the Dusty Creek was a broken one. There were 8 men drinking that evening. A cattle hand named Roscoe who had just been paid and was already 3 whiskeys deep. 2 brothers named Dodd who dealt in horses and avoided eye contact with lawmen. A traveling preacher who drank more than he prayed, which was why he was traveling. And in the corner, with his back to the wall and his hat low over his eyes, a man named Isaac Collier who had been nursing the same glass of rye for the better part of an hour, not because he was being careful with money, but because he was thinking. Isaac was 30 years old. He had the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and work into something that was not conventionally handsome, but was deeply, undeniably interesting. His jaw was sharp, his eyes were a steady gray-green that changed depending on the light, and he had a scar above his left eyebrow from a situation in his 20s that he did not discuss in polite company. He was a man who had come to New Mexico territory 3 years ago to start a cattle operation of modest size on a spread of land he had purchased legitimately, which in this territory was unusual enough to make people suspicious of him. He was not a lawman. He was not a gambler. He was not a hired gun. He was simply a rancher who read books and kept his accounts in order and had a reputation for being unusually fair to the men who worked for him. He had been thinking that evening about a water access dispute with a neighboring rancher named Harlan Webb, and he had been thinking about it without resolution for the better part of the hour, which was why the whiskey was still in the glass. He was not a man who drank to think. He was a man who thought first and drank after, as a kind of punctuation. Then the door opened and Anna Shepard walked in, and the room changed the way a room changes when something real enters it among all the ordinary things. She did not look at anyone directly. She went to the bar and put both hands flat on it, as though she needed something solid beneath her palms, and she said to the bartender, whose name was Clyde, "I need a room for the night, and I can pay in the morning if you'll extend me the credit." Clyde was a man of 55 who had seen most things twice. He looked at her cheek, where the bruise was coming up dark purple along the bone, and he looked at her wrist, where the rope burn was raw and red, and he set a glass of water in front of her without being asked and said, "2 bits. Pay me when you can." The door banged open before she could respond. 2 men came in with the particular kind of confidence that belongs to people who have decided that the world will accommodate them or suffer the consequence. The older one was Clement Hargrove, 38 years old, broad across the chest, with a mustache that he kept trimmed because he considered himself a man of some refinement. The younger one was Declan Hargrove, 31, leaner and quicker, and with something in his eyes that was colder than his brother's blunt anger. They were cattle men of moderate success and immoderate self-regard, and they were the two brothers who had, between them, reduced Anna Shepard to a woman walking into a saloon in the dark with rope burns on her wrists. The story of Anna and the Hargrove brothers was the kind of story that the territory produced with grim regularity, and that nobody wrote down because everybody already knew the shape of it. Anna had come west 2 years prior from Missouri after her father died and left nothing but debt. She had answered an advertisement placed by Clement Hargrove, seeking a housekeeper for his ranch outside Dusty Creek, because it was that or the charitable institution's ensign. Louis and she had made her choice with the information available to her. She had arrived to find that Clement Hargrove's idea of a housekeeper was closer to a captive, and that his ranch was 20 miles from the nearest town on a stretch of land where a woman without a horse was, effectively, without options. She had worked for 2 years. She had cooked and cleaned and kept accounts and mended fences alongside the ranch hands, and done every task that was put to her because it was that or be put out into the desert with nothing. And nothing in the New Mexico desert in 1878 was a death sentence more often than not. She had been patient. She had been strategic. She had been looking, every day, for the correct moment to leave. The trouble had come 3 months ago when Declan Hargrove had returned from a failed mining venture in Arizona and moved back into his brother's house, and made it immediately clear that he considered Anna Shepard part of the property inventory. Clement, who had his own designs on Anna that he had expressed through years of low-level intimidation rather than direct action, had not appreciated his younger brother's interest. And so, in the way of men who cannot communicate honestly about anything, they had begun to negotiate. The negotiation had lasted 3 months. It had involved whiskey and cards and raised voices, and at least 2 fistfights between the brothers that Anna had witnessed through the thin wall of her room, with her hands pressed flat against the wood, and her heart pressed flat against her ribs. And it had ended 4 days ago, with Clement announcing that he had settled the matter, that Declan had a debt from a card game 2 years ago that he could never repay in cash, and that Anna would be transferred to Declan's keeping in satisfaction of that debt, as though she were a horse or a parcel of land. Anna had heard this announced at dinner. She had set down her fork, folded her napkin, and gone to her room. She had spent the next 3 days preparing. She had saved $6 over 2 years from small tasks and careful economies. She had identified the one moment each day when both brothers were occupied, which was the 4 o'clock feeding of the cattle when both men went to the south pasture. She had taken what she could carry in a single bundle: her father's pocket watch, a change of clothing, her $6, and a small knife she kept in her boot because she was not without sense. And she had walked north through the desert in the heat of a New Mexico afternoon for 8 miles until she reached the road, and then she had walked the road for another 12 miles until Dusty Creek appeared ahead of her like a promise she wasn't sure she could cash. The rope burns were from the first day, when Clement had caught her trying to leave earlier and had tied her wrists before she'd gotten smart enough to choose the right moment. He had let her go after an hour, satisfied that he'd made his point. He had not made the point he thought he had made. He had instead shown her precisely how serious he was, which had made her more careful and more determined. So she was at the bar in the Dusty Creek Saloon with rope burns on her wrists and a bruise on her cheek and $6 in her boot, and the door had just opened behind her. "Anna," Clement Hargrove said from the doorway. She did not turn around. She kept her hands flat on the bar. "I am going to need that room," she said to Clyde quietly and with a steadiness that surprised them both. "Anna, you come outside with us right now, and we will forget this foolishness happened," Clement said, walking toward her. His voice was the calm voice of a man who expects to be obeyed and has not yet processed that he will not be. Declan came in behind him and took up a position near the door. The 8 men in the saloon did a variety of things. Roscoe, the cattle hand, turned back to his drink. The Dodd brothers looked at each other. The traveling preacher found something interesting in the bottom of his glass. And Isaac Collier in the corner set down his rye, pushed his chair back quietly, and stood up. "She said she needs a room," Isaac said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had a particular quality of settled certainty that carries in a quiet room, the way a single note from a good guitar carries in an empty church. Clement Hargrove turned to look at him. He took in the man in the corner, the plain clothes, the worn hat, the hands that were a rancher's hands, broad and calloused, and he made an assessment that was not entirely wrong but was fatally incomplete. "This is not your affair," Clement said. "A woman walks into a public establishment and asks for a room," Isaac said, coming away from the wall slowly and without theatrics, "and 2 men follow her in to drag her out. In my experience, that tends to become everybody's affair whether they want it to or not." Anna had turned now. She was looking at Isaac Collier with the expression of someone who has been in a desert for a long time and is not quite sure whether the water ahead of them is real. She did not know this man. She did not know whether his standing up was going to help her or simply add another element to the problem. But she noted the quality of his stillness. She noted that he was not posturing, not performing. He was simply standing there, meaning every word he said. "This woman," Declan said from the door, with a particular emphasis on the word that made it sound like a category rather than a description, "belongs to my family. She works for us. She left without notice and without permission, and we are here to bring her home. People are not property," Isaac said, "and she is not going anywhere she does not choose to go." "She is not yours to speak for," Clement said, and his voice had shifted into something harder. "She is not yours either," Isaac said. "And that is rather the whole point." There was a silence in the Dusty Creek that had weight to it. The oil lamps flickered. The crack in the mirror threw Isaac's reflection into 2 pieces. Then Anna Shepard, who had not been passive in this entire exchange but had been thinking very quickly, said, "He is my husband." Everyone looked at her. Isaac Collier looked at her most intently of all, and in his eyes there was not confusion but something that looked very much like a man rapidly reconsidering his situation and deciding to follow the lead of someone who clearly knew what she was doing. "That is correct," Isaac said, with only a half-second pause that only Anna noticed. "She is my wife. And I would thank you gentlemen to remove yourselves from this establishment before this conversation takes a direction that none of us will enjoy." Clement Hargrove's face went through a series of colors. He looked at Anna. He looked at Isaac. He looked at the room where nobody was offering him support and where Clyde the bartender had reached below the counter in a gesture that had a clear meaning. "This is not finished," Clement said. "It is finished for tonight," Isaac said, "and I would encourage you to let it be finished permanently." Clement and Declan Hargrove left. The door banged shut behind them. The room exhaled. Anna turned back to the bar and gripped it with both hands, and for a moment she simply breathed. Then she picked up the glass of water Clyde had given her and drank half of it in one long swallow. Isaac came to the bar. He stood a respectful distance from her, far enough to make it clear he was not crowding her, and he said quietly, "That was resourceful." "I needed it to work," she said. "I apologize for involving you without warning." "I was already involved," he said. "I stood up before you said it." She looked at him then fully for the first time. She was assessing him the way a person assesses a situation when they have learned that everything requires assessment. She took in the steady eyes, the calm posture, the fact that he had not touched her, had not moved toward her, had not inserted himself into her story as a hero requiring her gratitude. He had simply stood between her and a problem. "Why?" she asked. He thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about everything. "Because it was the right thing," he said, "and because nobody else was going to." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "They will be back in the morning." "I know," he said. "I have $6 and no particular destination." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a ranch 4 miles north of town. I employ 3 good men, and I need a cook and someone who can keep accounts. Because I do a poor job of the accounts and an excellent job of the cattle, but neither of those things is useful without the other." He paused. "This is a legitimate offer of legitimate employment. I'm not Clement Hargrove." She studied him. "How do I know that?" "You do not," he said honestly. "But Clyde has known me for 3 years and he is standing right there." They both looked at Clyde. Clyde said, without looking up from the glass he was polishing, "Collier is straight. One of the straightest men in the territory, which is not saying much for the territory but is saying a great deal for the man." Anna looked at her water glass. She looked at the crack in the mirror. She looked at Isaac Collier, who was waiting without pressure, which was itself a kind of information. "I would need my own room," she said. "There is a room in the house that has its own door to the outside," he said, "with a bolt on the inside. And I would need a fair wage. $8 a month," he said, "plus board, plus the use of a horse when you need one." She had been earning nothing at the Hargrove Ranch unless you counted the thin charity of food and a roof. $8 a month was more than fair. It was, in the context of her current situation, extraordinary. "All right," she said. She straightened her spine and looked at him directly. "My name is Anna Shepard. Isaac Collier," he said. He extended his hand and she shook it. And it was the kind of handshake that meant something. The kind that two people give each other when they understand that a real agreement has just been made. That night, Anna slept in the room above the Dusty Creek Saloon that Clyde provided, with a chair wedged under the door handle in addition to the lock because old habits are earned. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the strange machinery of chance. That she had walked into this particular saloon on this particular evening, and that the one man who had stood up had been the kind of man who stood up for the right reasons rather than the wrong ones. She did not allow herself to feel hope yet. Hope was a luxury that she had learned to ration carefully. But she allowed herself to feel something smaller and more durable than hope, which was the sense that tomorrow was going to be different from yesterday, and that different at this particular moment was enough. In the morning, Isaac Collier arrived at the saloon with 2 horses, which she thought was sensible because it meant nobody had to ride double, and because a woman on her own horse is a woman who can leave if she needs to. He brought her a biscuit from the bakery 2 doors down, wrapped in cloth, and he handed it to her without comment, and she understood that he was a man who addressed practical problems practically, and who did not make a performance of ordinary kindness. They rode north through the morning light, which was the particular gold and rose light of a New Mexico October that makes the desert look like a painting of itself. The sage was silver, and the dry grass was copper, and the mountains in the distance were the color of old bruises gradually healing. Anna ate her biscuit on horseback and watched the land and felt the particular quality of silence that exists between 2 strangers who are not uncomfortable with each other. Isaac pointed out landmarks as they rode. The dry creek bed that ran water in spring, the mesa to the east that marked the edge of his property, the line of cottonwoods ahead that meant his well was good. He did not chatter. He gave her information because information was useful, and he trusted her to find it so. The ranch was modest but well kept. The main house was adobe, whitewashed, with a deep porch that faced west for the sunsets. There were 2 outbuildings, a barn that held 6 horses and smelled of hay and leather, and a smaller structure that served as bunkhouse for the 3 hands. The yard was swept. The fence posts were straight. The whole place had the feeling of something that was maintained not for appearances, but because a man who let things fall into disorder was a man who was losing his grip on things, and Isaac Collier had a grip on things. The 3 ranch hands were introduced. A quiet Mexican man named Rafael Vega, who had worked horses all his life, and had a gentleness with animals that bordered on the supernatural. A tall young man from Tennessee named Sam Beaumont, who was 20 years old and enthusiastic about cattle in a way that suggested he had not yet been worn down by them. And an older man named Pete Holloway, who said very little, observed everything, and had been with Isaac since the beginning of the operation. They looked at Anna with the variety of expressions that men deploy when a woman appears unexpectedly in a male space. Raphael nodded politely. Sam Beaumont took off his hat. Pete Holloway looked at her wrists and then at Isaac and then back at his fence post without comment, but the look had said enough. "Miss Shepard will be taking the East Room," Isaac said. "She will handle the cooking and the accounts. She is to be treated with the respect you would give to any employer. Questions?" There were no questions. The East Room had a window that faced the mountains and a bolt on the inside of the door that had clearly been recently installed, because the wood around it was fresh and pale, where the old paint had not yet been matched. Anna noticed this and understood that Isaac had ridden back the previous night after leaving the saloon and installed it himself before morning. She ran her finger along the fresh wood and felt something move in her chest that she immediately disciplined back into its proper place. The first week was about establishing the ordinary rhythms of the work. Anna cooked 3 meals a day for 5 people, which was a quantity of cooking she was accustomed to from the Hargrove Ranch. But the difference was that here the men thanked her, that here she was asked what she needed from town rather than handed a list of her own duties, and that here Isaac sat at the same table as his hands and ate the same food without hierarchy, which she found both unusual and profoundly decent. She took over the accounts on the 3rd day, when Isaac set the ledger before her with the expression of a man confessing to a failure he has accepted. The accounts were not wrong, exactly. They were simply organized in a way that suggested a person who understood numbers but not the order in which numbers ought to appear. She spent one afternoon reorganizing the system, and when she showed Isaac the new structure, he looked at it for a long moment and then said, "I have been doing this very inefficiently for 3 years." "You have been doing it honestly," she said, "which is rarer and more important. The efficiency can be taught." He looked at her then with an expression that she was beginning to recognize, a kind of quiet attention that meant he was seeing her clearly and finding what he saw worth looking at. She was careful with that expression. She did not encourage it. She was not in a position to encourage anything, and she had not yet determined whether Isaac Collier was the man he appeared to be or simply a more sophisticated version of the men she had escaped. She had been wrong about Clement Hargrove, and she intended to be thorough before she was wrong about anyone else. The days accumulated. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, systematically and with attention to detail. She learned which of the horses was temperamental and which was generous. She learned that Sam Beaumont was homesick for Tennessee and dealt with it by talking about it too much, and that Pete Holloway was not cold, but simply processed the world through his hands rather than his mouth, and that Raphael Vega had a family in the town of Mesilla that he sent money to every month and thought about every day. She learned that Isaac Collier read by lamplight every evening, that he owned more books than any man in the territory she had ever heard of, that he had opinions about irrigation and cattle genetics and political economy, that he had clearly arrived at through genuine thought rather than received wisdom. She began to relax by increments so small as to be nearly invisible, but she noticed them. The night she did not wedge the chair under the door handle, the morning she did not assess the exits before she sat down to breakfast, the afternoon she laughed at something Sam Beaumont said without first checking whether it was safe to laugh. 3 weeks after her arrival, Clement Hargrove came. He came alone, which meant he had thought about it, which meant it was more carefully dangerous than the saloon had been. He came in the middle of the afternoon, when he had calculated that Isaac would be in the south pasture with the hands. He was not wrong about the calculation, but he did not account for the fact that Anna Shepard looked out the window before she answered any knock at the door, which was a habit she had developed during 2 years of careful living. She saw Clement's horse at the gate, and she felt the cold clarity that comes to people who have been afraid for a long time and have learned to function within it. She did not open the door. She went to the window that faced the barn and she put 2 fingers in her mouth and produced a whistle that carried across the yard. Raphael Vega appeared from the barn within 30 seconds. He looked at the window, looked at the horse at the gate, and nodded once. He went to the gate and met Clement Hargrove before Clement reached the porch. Anna could not hear the conversation, but she watched through the window and she saw the body language, which was sufficient. Clement was explaining himself with the particular expansiveness of a man who believes his explanation is his best weapon. Raphael was listening with the particular stillness of a man who is not persuaded by words, but by the shape of situations. And then Pete Holloway appeared from the bunkhouse and leaned against the fence post and started cleaning his fingernails with his pocket knife. And Sam Beaumont came around the corner of the barn and occupied a position that was casual but geometrically deliberate. Clement Hargrove looked at the three men and did his arithmetic and found the numbers unfavorable. He said something sharp. She could see it in the set of his jaw, and then he turned his horse and rode south. Raphael came to the kitchen door. He says he will be back with the sheriff. The sheriff in this county, Anna said, has been paid for meals at the Hargrove table for 10 years. Yes, Raphael said. He was quiet for a moment. Isaac should know. I know, she said. He will be back at sundown. I will tell him then. She thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about whether to leave, whether to take her $6 and whatever wages Isaac had not yet paid her and find her way further west, further into anonymity. She thought about whether staying was fair to Isaac, whether she was bringing a problem onto his ranch that was hers alone to carry. She thought about the installed bolt on her door and the horse he had told her to use whenever she needed it. And she thought about a man who reorganized his whole life with 3 days' notice, because a stranger needed a place that was safe. She was still thinking when the hands came in from the south pasture, and Isaac came to wash up at the pump in the yard, and she went to the porch and said, "Clement Hargrove came today." Isaac dried his hands on the cloth hanging from the pump post. He did not look alarmed. He looked thoughtful, which she had come to understand was his version of serious. "I figured he would," he said. "What did he want?" "To take me back." Raphael and Pete and Sam discouraged him, but he said he would bring the sheriff. "And the sheriff here," Isaac said, "takes his meals at the Hargrove table." She blinked. "You know about that." "I know most things about this county," he said. He came up onto the porch and stood with her in the cooling October air and looked out at the desert to the south. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly. You are not a debt that those men are owed. You are not property. You are not an obligation. Whatever they told themselves or told each other about what you are to them, they were wrong, and the sheriff being paid for his opinions does not change what is right." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you propose?" "There is a circuit judge," he said, "who comes through Dusty Creek every 6 weeks. He is not the Hargrove family's dinner guest. His name is Judge Walter Crane, and he is from Ohio, and he has a particular dislike for men who treat women as assets. He will be in Dusty Creek in 4 days. And what do I tell him?" "The truth," Isaac said. "That you were brought here under a false contract of employment. That you were held against your will. That a debt between 2 brothers was settled using you as currency." The words hit her differently in his voice than they had in the silent privacy of her own understanding. He said them without flinching, without dressing them up, and she felt the particular dignity of having a wrong named correctly. "Will it hold?" she asked. "I believe it will," he said. "I also believe that Clement Hargrove will apply pressure before the judge arrives, and I think it would be wise for you to not be alone until then." She looked at him steadily. "I have not been alone since I got here." He looked back at her with that quiet attention and said, "No, you have not." The next 4 days had a particular quality of suspended tension, the way a storm feels when it is building but has not yet broken. Isaac stayed closer to the ranch than usual. Pete Holloway took up a habit of sitting on the porch with his coffee in the mornings, in a position that gave him sightlines to the road. Anna cooked and kept accounts and went about her work with deliberate steadiness, not because she was without fear, but because she had learned that steadiness was its own kind of armor. On the second evening, Isaac brought a book to the table after supper instead of retiring to read alone. He set it open beside his coffee cup and read quietly, and it was such an ordinary domestic gesture that it took Anna a moment to realize that he had changed his habit deliberately, to be present, to make the evening less solitary. She was mending a seam in her only other dress, and Sam Beaumont was writing a letter home, and Raphael was at the other end of the table cleaning a bridle, and Pete Holloway was somewhere on the porch, and the lamp made a warm gold circle that included everyone. She looked at Isaac over the top of her mending and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away immediately, which was new. "What are you reading?" she asked. He showed her the spine. It was a volume of Charles Dickens' Bleak House, which she had read 4 years ago in Missouri and had found both magnificent and deeply exhausting. "I have read that," she said. He looked pleasantly surprised. "What did you think of it?" "I thought Esther Summerson was one of the most genuinely kind people in literature," she said, "and I thought the system that ground her down was drawn with too much accuracy to be comfortable." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is a better reading than most critics have given it." "I had a teacher in Missouri who believed that women should be educated as thoroughly as men," she said, "and who acted on that belief at some professional risk. I am indebted to her in ways I cannot fully calculate." "What happened to her?" he asked. "She married a farmer and moved to Kansas," Anna said. "She still taught her children." "I suppose some people carry their purpose with them regardless of the setting." He looked at her with the particular attention again, and she looked back at him, and this time there was something warmer in it, something that had been approaching slowly from a distance and had now arrived close enough to be identified. She looked back down at her mending. On the third day, Clement Hargrove came again, and this time he brought the sheriff. Sheriff Dale Murdoch was a broad man of 50 with a badge that he wore as though it were a coat of paint rather than an obligation, and he came up to the porch with Clement at his shoulder and said, in the voice of a man who had decided in advance what the outcome would be, that he needed to speak to the woman who had abandoned her employment and was suspected of having taken property from the Hargrove ranch. Isaac stepped onto the porch before Anna could reach the door. "What property?" he said. Clement said smoothly, "She took $6 from the household." "That was my wage," Anna said from behind Isaac. She stepped out onto the porch because standing behind someone was not the same as being safe, and she had decided some time ago that the only version of safety worth having was the kind that came from standing in your own right. 2 years of work at $3 a month. "We never agreed on a wage," Clement said. "You advertised for a housekeeper," she said. "In the Albuquerque paper. I still have the advertisement." She did have it. She had saved it in her father's pocket watch case, because she had understood from the moment things began to go wrong that paper with words on it was sometimes the only thing between a person and someone else's version of the truth. Sheriff Murdoch looked at Clement. Clement's expression shifted slightly. "That is not relevant," the sheriff said, recovering. "The issue is that she left an employment arrangement without proper notice, and the issue," Isaac said, "is that Miss Shepard is a free woman who terminated an employment that had been conducted under false pretenses, and that the attempt to bring her back by force constitutes unlawful detention, which I believe is a matter for Judge Crane, who arrives tomorrow." The name Judge Crane produced a small but unmistakable reaction in Sheriff Murdoch's face. The judge was, apparently, known. "Now," Isaac said, "you are welcome to return tomorrow when the judge is available to hear any claim the Hargrove family wishes to make. Until then, Miss Shepard is a guest on my property, and your presence here without a warrant is unwelcome." Murdoch was a man who operated best when everyone around him was either intimidated or paid. Isaac was neither. He looked at Clement, and Clement looked at Anna, and Anna looked at Clement with the steadiness of a woman who has already decided she is not going back, and the sum of all those looks produced an outcome that was unsatisfying for Clement and Murdoch but mathematically unavoidable. They left. Anna stood on the porch until they were out of sight, and then she put her hand on the porch post and let out one long, slow breath that had been waiting since she first heard the horses on the road. Isaac stood beside her. He said nothing. He was a man who understood that not every moment required words. After a while she said, "Thank you. You did most of it yourself," he said. "The advertisement was the key. I would not have thought of that." "I kept it for 2 years," she said. "I kept it because I knew that one day I would need it to be true." He looked at her profile, the clean line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the place where the bruise on her cheek was yellowing and fading at the edges, and he felt something that had been growing steadily for 3 weeks reach a kind of fullness that was uncomfortable to contain and impossible to ignore. He said nothing. It was not the moment. He was a man who was careful about moments. Judge Walter Crane arrived the following morning aboard the stage from Santa Fe, a thin man of 62 with wire-rimmed glasses and a posture that suggested he considered slouching a moral failure. He set up in the back room of the general store, which served as the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a courthouse, and he heard matters in the order they were presented to him. Isaac had written a letter the night before and sent Sam Beaumont to town with it at first light. The letter described the situation clearly, attached a copy of the original employment advertisement that Anna had provided, and requested that the matter of Anna Shepard's status and any claims made upon her by the Hargrove family be heard before any other business. It was heard at 10 in the morning. Anna sat in a chair before the judge's table and told her story with the clarity of someone who has rehearsed it, not because she had not had time, but because it was true, and true things have a particular clarity that rehearsed ones often lack. She described the advertisement, the arrival, the 2 years, the brothers' negotiation over her person, the rope burns, the walking out, all of it in order, without embellishment and without omission. Isaac sat beside her, and when he spoke as a corroborating witness, and as a man who had employed her legitimately. And Clyde from the saloon was there as well because Isaac had thought to ask him, and Clyde described the state Anna had been in when she arrived at his establishment, and what he had observed of the Hargrove brothers' behavior. Clement Hargrove presented his case, which consisted largely of asserting that Anna had been well treated and was ungrateful and had stolen his money. He produced no advertisement. He produced no employment contract. He produced no evidence of any payment made to her in 2 years. He had Sheriff Murdoch, who offered his endorsement of Clement's character in terms that Judge Crane listened to with the expression of a man who has heard many such endorsements and has learned to discount them precisely in proportion to their enthusiasm. Judge Crane asked 3 questions of Clement Hargrove. He asked whether there was a written employment agreement. There was not. He asked whether Anna Shepard had ever been free to leave the property using her own transportation. She had not had access to a horse or vehicle without Clement's permission. He asked whether the $6 in her possession had been explicitly agreed upon as her wage at the time of hiring. It had not, but the advertisement had named a wage commensurate with similar positions, which the judge noted. His ruling took 4 minutes to deliver and was absolute. Anna Shepard was a free woman who had fulfilled and then been wrongly detained in an employment arrangement that had materially deviated from the terms under which it had been offered. Any claim the Hargrove family had on her person or on the $6 she carried was without legal or moral basis. Furthermore, the judge noted for the record that the practice of settling personal debts between individuals using the labor or person of a third party was reprehensible, and in his view, legally actionable under territorial statutes, a point he directed to Sheriff Murdoch with a look that suggested the sheriff's future conduct was being evaluated in real time. Clement Hargrove stood up and said something in a voice that was tightly controlled but shaking at the edges. Judge Crane looked at him over the wire glasses and said, "Sir, you may remove yourself from this room before I find additional matters to address." Clement removed himself. Anna sat in the chair for a moment after the room had mostly emptied. Isaac was beside her. She was looking at the table in front of her with the expression of someone who has received something they needed so badly that receiving it is almost overwhelming. "It is done," Isaac said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was very even. He waited. He gave her the silence she needed to process the shift in her world. Then she looked up at him and said, with the particular quality of a smile that has been saved up through difficulty, and is therefore more valuable than an easy one, "I suppose I owe Clyde 2 bits." He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, a warm, genuine sound that surprised her with its openness, and she found that it did something uncomplicated and lovely to her chest. They rode back to the ranch in the October afternoon, and the light was good, and the air smelled of sage and something cooler coming from the mountains. And for the first time since she had left Missouri 2 years ago, Anna Shepard felt something that she gradually identified as the specific physical sensation of not being afraid. The weeks that followed the judge's ruling were different in quality from the weeks before it. The tension that had underscored every day since Anna's arrival lifted, not all at once but gradually, the way a headache lifts, in increments that you notice only by comparison with how it had been before. The ranch settled into its rhythms. The cattle were brought down from the summer range for the winter. The accounts were in better order than they had ever been, which Isaac noted with genuine appreciation. Sam Beaumont's letters home began to include descriptions of New Mexico that suggested he was making peace with the landscape. And Isaac Collier and Anna Shepard began the slow and careful process of learning each other, not as a woman who needed safety and a man who provided it, but as two people who discovered, to their mutual and private astonishment, that they liked each other enormously. He learned that she had opinions about nearly everything and expressed them with precision rather than heat. He learned that she was funny in a dry, unexpected way that caught you off guard because her face stayed serious, and then the thing she said would be so precisely observed that you laughed before you'd registered that a joke had been made. He learned that she had a habit of touching things she was thinking about, the edge of a table, the spine of a book, a fence rail, as though thinking required some tactile anchor, and he found this habit so particular and so entirely hers that he began to notice the objects she touched and to feel, irrationally, that they were in some way blessed by the contact. She learned that he was more complicated than his quietness suggested. He had strong feelings about a great many things and expressed them in writing, in the margins of books and in the back pages of his ledgers, observations and arguments and questions that she came across by accident, and then with increasing deliberateness. She learned that he was from Virginia originally, that he had left after the war because the landscape of his childhood had been so thoroughly altered by what had happened there that he could no longer see it without seeing the alteration, and that New Mexico was far enough west to be, if not new, at least different enough to build something on. She learned that he was a man who had been alone for a long time and had made peace with it without losing the part of himself that understood the value of connection. In November, a cold front came down from the mountains, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an afternoon, and the first frost came overnight and killed the last of the summer garden. Anna made a soup from the last vegetables and dried beans that Raphael said was the best thing he had eaten since his wife's cooking in Mesilla, which was a high compliment and was received as such. That evening after supper, the hands retreated to the bunkhouse, and Isaac stayed at the table with his book, and Anna stayed at the table with the accounts, which had a quarterly summary due, and the lamp made its warm circle, and the frost was on the window glass, and the wood in the stove made its small punctuating sounds in the silence. Isaac looked up from his book and found her frowning at a column of numbers. "The third quarter," he said. "The problem is the feed cost from August." "I bought more than I should have." She looked up. "How did you know which column I was on?" "You have different frowns," he said. "That one is the August feed cost." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked back at the ledger and said, very carefully, "You have been watching me closely enough to categorize my frowns." The silence that followed this observation was a particular kind of silence, full and warm and slightly dangerous, the way a room feels when two people have both just said something true. "I have," he said. He said it simply, without retreat. She kept her eyes on the ledger for a moment. Then she looked up and the lamplight was on both their faces and she said, equally simply, "I have been watching you too." Outside, the frost was settling. Inside, something settled too, though in an entirely different way. They did not do anything about it immediately. They were both too careful for that, and they both had histories that had taught them to be certain before they were vulnerable. But the knowing was out in the room between them now, quiet and solid as the table they sat at, and neither of them tried to take it back. In December, Rafael Vega went home to Mesilla for Christmas and came back in January with his wife and 2 children. Because his wife had decided she had been away from her husband long enough, and that Mesilla without Rafael was less useful than wherever Rafael happened to be. Her name was Elena, and she was a small, decisive woman with magnificent dark hair, and an immediate, clear-eyed assessment of Anna Shepard that concluded, within about 20 minutes, that Anna was both entirely capable and entirely alone in a way that Elena considered unnecessary. Elena did not keep her conclusions to herself. She told Raphael, who told her to mind her own business, and she told him that she always minded her own business, which was simply that her business included the business of people she liked. She liked Anna. She liked Isaac, whom she described to Raphael as a man who is very much in love and is being very careful about it, which is sweet but also becoming a little ridiculous. "He will get there," Raphael said. "He needs encouragement," Elena said. "You are going to interfere," Raphael said. "I am going to cook a big dinner," Elena said serenely. "And I am going to invite everyone, and I am going to make sure Isaac and Anna sit next to each other. What happens after that is entirely up to them." The dinner happened on a Saturday in January, and it was magnificent. Elena cooked 3 dishes and made a cake with dried fruit that Sam Beaumont said was better than his mother's, and then immediately apologized for saying it. Pete Holloway said more words during dinner than he had said in the previous 2 months combined, which everyone took as a sign of how good the food was. Raphael told stories about horses he had known the way other men told stories about people, with affection and character detail and genuinely satisfying endings. Anna and Isaac sat next to each other, which they had done before at meals, but somehow this evening, with the warmth and the good food and Elena's particular brand of hospitable conspiracy, the ordinary adjacency of their shoulders felt different. At some point during the meal, their arms were touching at the table, and neither of them moved away from it. After dinner, when the hands had gone and Elena was putting the children to bed in the room they'd borrowed, Isaac poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat across from Anna and said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "I have not been uncertain about many things in my life," he said. "I tend to know my own mind. But I have been uncertain about the correct way to say this, which is that I have been falling in love with you since roughly the 3rd day you were here, when you reorganized the accounts, and then told me that honesty was rarer than efficiency, and I have been waiting to say it until I was sure it would not frighten you or make you feel obligated." She was very still. "I am telling you now," he said, "not because I expect anything in return, but because I think you are someone who deserves to be told what is true, and the truth is that you are the most remarkable person I have met in 30 years, and I love you." The kitchen was warm. The lamp was low. Outside, the January wind was moving across the desert and making the sound it makes against adobe walls, a low constant hum like something breathing. Anna Shepard, who had been careful for so long, who had been strategic and watchful and patient, felt all of that careful architecture shift and rearrange itself around something simpler and more solid. "I have been falling in love with you too," she said, "since you stood up in the saloon. Not because you stood up exactly, but because of how you stood up, without making it about yourself, without making it about what you would get for it." "I got rather a lot," he said quietly. "So did I," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand gently, with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat in the warm kitchen with the wind outside, and the lamp between them and the whole large fact of it filling the room. He asked her, 6 weeks later, on a February afternoon when the desert was cold and clear, and the mountains were white to their midpoints with snow, whether she would marry him. He asked it while they were both on horseback, coming back from checking the north fence line, because he was a man who did not contrive moments but let them happen in the ordinary course of things. He said it plainly and directly, and with his hat in his hands and his horse's breath making fog in the cold air, and she looked at him across the space between their horses and said yes, with a certainty that had nothing careful or strategic about it. That was simply the most honest thing she had ever said. The wedding was small because they wanted it small. The circuit judge was back through in March, and being both efficient and romantic in the way that practical people sometimes secretly are, agreed to marry them in the general storeroom where he had previously made his ruling on Anna's freedom, which felt to both of them like an appropriate symmetry. Elena Vega cried. Sam Beaumont cried too and was embarrassed about it. Rafael Vega did not cry but smiled for most of the day, and Pete Holloway shook Isaac's hand and said, "Good," which was the most emotionally extended statement anyone had heard him make. Clyde from the Dusty Creek Saloon came because Isaac had invited him and because he had been there at the beginning and deserved to be there for this. He brought a bottle of very good bourbon, the best in his establishment, and said that it was on the house in honor of the occasion. Anna wore her best dress, which Elena had helped her to press and which was green, a real green this time, not faded, because Isaac had brought fabric from Santa Fe 3 weeks earlier, and she had made it herself on a borrowed sewing machine, and it was the first entirely new thing she had made for herself in 2 years. Isaac wore his good suit, which fit him well and which he had apparently owned for some years and taken meticulous care of because he was meticulous about things he valued. They exchanged words before the judge that were both legal and, in their simplicity, more moving than elaborate speeches would have been. Isaac looked at Anna through the whole thing with the steady attention that she had come to understand was his love's outward form, and she looked back at him without looking away, and when the judge pronounced them married, she felt the word settle over her life the way the first warm day of spring settles over the desert, changing not what is there but how it appears. They went home to the ranch. Spring came with its particular extravagance over the New Mexico desert, the wildflowers appearing in improbable quantities in the arroyos, the mountains going from white to gray-green as the snow retreated, the cattle restless and purposeful with the new season. Anna planted a kitchen garden in the south corner of the yard, working the hard desert soil into something that would sustain tomatoes and peppers and squash. Isaac built her a better fence for it on a Saturday morning without being asked, because he had noticed the rabbits and drawn the logical conclusion. She stood in the garden doorway and watched him work and felt a happiness that was entirely unspectacular and entirely sufficient, the kind of happiness that does not announce itself but simply persists, day after ordinary day, accumulating into something enormous. That summer, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Isaac on a warm evening in June, standing at the gate of the kitchen garden, and he went very still the way he went still when something moved him profoundly. Then he put his arms around her and held her with a care and a fierceness simultaneously that she had not known a single embrace could contain, and against her hair he said something that she felt rather than heard, some word too private to be fully formed, some expression of the enormity of what was happening. The pregnancy was not easy, but it was not frightening. Elena Vega, who had delivered 2 children of her own and attended the births of several friends in Mesilla, became Anna's primary support with a naturalness that had no drama to it, just practical presence. Isaac hovered at a respectful distance and was extremely useful in ways that did not require hovering, keeping the water cistern full and the firewood stacked, and the household accounts in perfect order so that Anna did not have to think about them. He read to her in the evenings, from Dickens and from George Eliot, and from a new novel that had come in a package from a bookseller in Santa Fe, and his voice in the lamplight was the last thing she heard before she slept, and the first thing she oriented toward when she woke. The baby came in February of 1880, during a brief warm spell that gave the desert 3 days of nearly spring-like weather before the cold returned. It was a boy. He was born in the main house with Alina beside Anna and Isaac in the next room where he could hear, and was not capable of sitting still, but was also not capable of being useful, so he paced. When Alina opened the door and told him he had a son, he walked in and looked at the small, red, angry person in Anna's arms with an expression of such complete undoing that Anna, who was exhausted in the profound cellular way of a person who has just done one of the most demanding things a body can do, felt tears on her own face. "He looks very serious," Isaac said. "He looks exactly like you," Anna said. "Yes," Isaac said, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at his son's face with wonder. "That is what I mean." They named him James William Collier, James for Anna's father and William for Isaac's, both men who had been imperfect but had been loved. James was a serene baby. He arrived in the world serious and remained serious, looking at everything around him with the alert gray-green eyes he had inherited from his father. He slept reliably, which Alina said was unusual, and Isaac attributed to the calm of the house, and Anna attributed to the sound of Isaac reading aloud in the evenings, which she believed James had heard through the better part of his gestation, and had found as reliable and soothing as she did. Dusty Creek itself was changing. 1880 brought more settlers, a second general store, a proper schoolhouse that was finished in October of that year. Anna watched the town grow with the particular attention she brought to everything, and she began, in the spring of 1881, to teach reading 2 afternoons a week in the schoolhouse, which did not yet have a permanent teacher. She had not planned this. It had arisen from the fact that she was there one afternoon to collect a package from the teacher's desk, when 3 children arrived expecting a lesson, and there was no teacher. And Anna had looked at the children and the blackboard and made a decision that was characteristic of her, which was that a thing that needed doing and could be done by the available person should simply be done. She taught reading on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and James came with her because he was too young to leave and was, in any case, extremely pleasant company, and he sat in a basket near the blackboard and regarded the proceedings with his father's particular quality of interested attention. Isaac found out 3 weeks in, when he came into town for supplies and stopped by the schoolhouse on his way back through, and heard Anna's voice from the window explaining the relationship between letters and sounds to a group of children who were listening with the specific quality of attention that real teaching produces. He stood outside the window for a while. Then he went home without disturbing her. That evening he said, "You are teaching at the schoolhouse." "Yes," she said, "you enjoy it, very much." He looked at her with the expression that was full of love and said, "When the permanent teacher comes, they will be receiving a school that has already been set in order. That seems to be something you do." She laughed. "I cannot help it." "I know," he said. "It is one of the approximately 100 things I love about you." The permanent teacher arrived in September of 1881, a woman named Miss Harriet Doyle from Pennsylvania, who was 25 and earnest and entirely capable, and Anna transitioned the Thursday class to her, with a thorough set of notes about each student's progress that Miss Doyle said, with genuine admiration, was more organized than any handoff she had received in her professional life. That autumn, the water dispute with Harlan Webb, the one Isaac had been thinking about the evening Anna walked into the Dusty Creek Saloon, was finally resolved through a territorial water commission that ruled in Isaac's favor, which meant the North Creek access was secured, and the winter hay supply was substantially improved. Isaac marked the occasion by expanding the herd by 40 head, which he had been wanting to do for 2 years and had been too cautious to do without the water security. The ranch grew. By 1882, they employed 5 hands, including Rafael Vega, who had by then fully committed to New Mexico and had brought the rest of his family up from Mesilla, and a new young man named Charlie Cross, who was from Texas and could shoe a horse faster than anyone any of them had ever seen. Sam Beaumont had finally gone back to Tennessee. Homesickness had eventually won, but he had gone warmly, and with a handshake from Isaac and a packed meal from Anna, and a very long letter for his family that he had dictated to Anna because his writing was not equal to his feelings. Pete Holloway remained, as steady and observant as ever, the bedrock of the operation. In the spring of 1882, Anna discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Isaac at breakfast, without ceremony, because they had arrived at the point in their marriage where the important things could be said over coffee as easily as under any more dramatic sky. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they stayed that way for a moment, and across the table James, who was too and very interested in the behavior of adults, watched them with his father's grave attention and said nothing. The second baby was born in December of 1882, at night, during a light snowfall that made everything quiet. It was a girl. She was born with a quantity of dark hair that was clearly her mother's and a set of lungs that was entirely her own, because she announced herself to the world at considerable volume and did not let up for some time, which was in such contrast to James's serenity that everyone in the house laughed, including Anna, between the difficult work of it. They named her Clara Elena Collier. Clara because Anna had always loved the name, and Elena because Elena Vega had been at both births, and at every point in between that had required the presence of a woman who was both practical and warm, and because some debts are best paid in names. James, at 2 years and 10 months, greeted his sister with the solemnity appropriate to the occasion. He was brought in to see her, and he looked at her for a long time with his gray-green eyes, and then he looked at his father and said, with careful enunciation, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Isaac said. James considered this. "All right," he said, apparently satisfied. Clara did not share her brother's gravity. She arrived in the world with opinions and expressed them. She was warm and loud and curious, and she walked before she was supposed to and talked before she was supposed to, and had her mother's particular quality of going directly to the point of any situation without preamble, which at 2 years old manifested as a certainty about what she wanted, and an absolute commitment to obtaining it that everyone found equal parts exhausting and magnificent. The years moved as years do in a good life, with rhythm and variation, with seasons that were sometimes difficult and usually beautiful, with the accumulation of ordinary days that are the actual material of happiness. The ranch grew into something substantial. Isaac's methods of breeding and land management became sufficiently well regarded that men came from as far as Santa Fe to look at what he had done, and he explained it patiently to everyone who asked because he believed that knowledge should be shared. Anna kept the accounts and kept teaching. Miss Doyle had eventually moved on, and Anna had, almost without meaning to, become the schoolteacher proper, which position she held with the same organized thoroughness she brought to everything. There came a day in the autumn of 1884, when James was 4 and Clara was almost 2, when Anna stood at the kitchen garden gate in the October afternoon, the same season, the same quality of light, as the first October she had been here, and looked out at the ranch that had become her home, and tried to measure the distance between who she had been and who she was now. She had been a woman who walked 20 miles in desert heat to escape a situation in which she had been treated as a ledger entry, a thing to be traded between men like a debt settled in human flesh. She had arrived at a bar with rope burns on her wrists and $6 in her boot, and exactly as much future as she could construct from those materials. And she had constructed this, not alone, but with her own hands and her own mind and her own choices, working in partnership with a man who understood that partnership meant 2 people moving in the same direction with equal say in the destination. She heard the door and turned, and Isaac came out onto the porch with Clara on his hip because Clara did not walk anywhere she could be carried, and James following behind with his serious little face. And Isaac looked at Anna at the garden gate with the expression that had not changed in 6 years, the full quiet attention of a man who finds what he loves and keeps finding it every day new. "Supper," he said. "In an hour," she said. "Come look at the mountains." He came down from the porch and stood beside her at the gate with Clara on his hip, pointing at things, and naming them with the confidence of a person who is not entirely certain of all the names, but is not going to let that slow her down. James stood on Anna's other side and put his small hand in hers without announcement, because he was a child who expressed affection through presence rather than declaration, exactly like his father. The mountains were blue and white, and the desert light was the October gold that had no equal anywhere Anna had ever been or expected to go. The sage was silver. The air smelled of frost coming and wood smoke and the particular clean emptiness of the high desert that takes some time to learn to love, but that once loved is not replaceable by anything else. "Do you remember," Anna said, "the first time we rode back from town together, the morning after the saloon?" "I remember everything from that time," he said. "You gave me a biscuit," she said, "from the bakery. You brought 2 horses," she said, "so I would have my own." "It seemed obvious," he said. "It was not obvious," she said. "It was not something you had to think about, it was just the thing you did." She was quiet for a moment. "That is when I started to hope." He shifted Clara on his hip and looked at the mountains. "I think I started to hope when you told Clement Hargrove I was your husband," he said, "because it meant you had looked at me and made a calculation that included me as someone trustworthy, and I thought, that is what I want to be, for that specific person." "You have been," she said. "So have you," he said. "Every day." Clara, having exhausted the visible objects within naming range, turned her attention to her father's hat and removed it and put it on her own head where it covered her face entirely. James watched this with the expression of someone cataloging the behavior of a smaller person whose logic he was working to understand. Anna laughed, and it was the laugh that had nothing careful in it anymore, the laugh of a woman who had learned that some things can be trusted absolutely and has therefore let the careful part of her rest. She leaned against Isaac's shoulder and felt the solid certain fact of him beside her, and he shifted to accommodate her and put his free arm around her without ceremony, because ceremony was for things you weren't sure of yet, and they were long past that. James looked up at his parents with his serious eyes and appeared to find the situation satisfactory. He turned back to the mountains and regarded them with the same quality of attention his father brought to things worth looking at, and the 4 of them stood at the garden gate in the October light with the mountains turning blue and the stars beginning to appear, one at a time, in the pale sky above the eastern range. Clyde retired from the Dusty Creek Saloon in 1885 and sold the establishment to a man named Garrity from Colorado, and before he left town, he came out to the ranch for a farewell supper that Anna cooked and Isaac presided over with genuine warmth. Clyde was 60 and going to live with his sister in Albuquerque, where there was a doctor he trusted and a pace of life that, he had decided, suited him better than the saloon's hours. He sat at the table and looked around at the family he had inadvertently helped to set in motion, at Anna and Isaac and James, who was 5 now, and asking Clyde extremely detailed questions about the management of a saloon, and Clara, who was climbing on things, and he shook his head slowly. "I put a glass of water in front of you," he said to Anna, "and I thought, this is a woman who has a very bad situation and I cannot fix it." "You helped fix it," Anna said. "I gave you water," he said. And Collier stood up. "You vouched for him," she said. "When I asked how I could know he was trustworthy, you said he was straight. That mattered." Clyde looked at Isaac. Isaac looked at the table. "You were both present at the beginning of something," Anna said simply. "That deserves acknowledgement." After Clyde left and the children were put to bed and the house was quiet, Isaac and Anna sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, the same kitchen table, the same lamp, though it was now a better lamp because the old one had finally given out. And Isaac was reading and Anna was doing the quarterly accounts, which were substantial now, the accounts of a flourishing operation, and this was such a replication of 100 previous evenings that they both felt it. Isaac looked up and found her looking at him. "August feed costs," he said. "The August feed costs are fine," she said. "I was not frowning about the accounts." "What were you frowning about?" she considered. "I was thinking about how it is possible that the best part of every day is sitting in this room with you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It is not a complicated thing. It is just the most important one." She looked at him across the lamplight and the table and the 6 years and the distance traveled, and she felt love in its full and settled form, not the exclamatory version that arrives at the beginning but the one that comes after, the one that has been tested and has held and has grown into something load-bearing and essential, the kind that you find when you stop being afraid to find it. "Come read to me," she said. He closed the book. They were back to Dickens. They were always back to Dickens, and he looked at her with a steady attention and he said, "In a moment." He picked up his pen and wrote something in the margin of the back page, the way he always wrote things in margins, the small private record of his thinking. She looked at him curiously. He turned the book so she could read it. In the margin, in his careful hand, he had written, "Anna Shepard Collier, the most remarkable person. October 1878 to always." She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at him. "Always," she said. "Always," he said. The lamp burned. The night outside was the deep silence of the desert, which is not a silence but a sound below sound, the sound of a vast and ancient land going about its business, unconcerned with the small illuminated rooms of the people who have settled within it, but not, perhaps, entirely indifferent to the small remarkable things that happen there. The mountains stood white-capped and old against the dark. The cattle moved in the south pasture. The kitchen garden waited under its frost for the spring that would always eventually arrive. James woke once in the night, as he sometimes did, and called out, and Isaac went to him and sat on the edge of his bed and said something quiet until James settled again. And Anna lay in the dark and listened to her husband's voice through the wall, low and steady and certain, and felt the happiness that needs no name because it is simply the condition of a life that has become exactly what it ought to be. In the morning, Anna rose before the light and went to the kitchen and built the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the window while the water heated and watched the desert lighten from black to gray to rose to gold. The same as always, the same as never. The ancient indifferent sky renewing itself with absolute faithfulness above the land. And she thought that this was what she had walked 20 miles for, and walked 12 more miles of road for, and walked into a saloon at night for, and sat before a judge for, and built a life for, this morning, this kitchen, this fire. This man who would come through the door in a few minutes with his hair not yet combed, wearing his work shirt, saying good morning in the voice that was the first thing she wanted to hear every day. The coffee was ready when he came in. She handed him his cup. He said good morning. Clara's voice came from down the hall, announcing consciousness and requiring attendance. James appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt with his gray-green eyes and his serious face, and said that he was hungry. Outside, Raphael was at the pump in the yard and the horses were moving in the barn, and Pete Holloway was opening the bunkhouse door, and the sun was coming up behind the eastern range, and throwing the first long gold light of the day across the desert floor. Anna Shepard Collier stood in her kitchen and looked at her life, and found it good not in the way that things are called good when they are merely adequate, but in the way that things are called good when they are exactly and truly and undeniably what they are meant to be, which is a kind of goodness that is its own proof and requires no further argument. She had been traded between two brothers like a debt. She had walked out of that account. She had walked into a saloon in the dark and a man had stood up, not for a debt, not for a prize, not for anything he expected to get, but because it was simply the right thing and because he was simply the kind of man who did the right thing, and because some moments are the hinge on which everything turns if you are paying attention. She had paid attention. So had he. That was, in the end, the whole of it. Two people paying attention to each other in a world that often made attention difficult, in a territory that was wild and beautiful and dangerous and magnificent, in a year and then a decade and then a life that accumulated into something neither of them had planned, but that both of them had chosen, every day, in the choosing that matters most, the small daily recommitment to the same person, the same home, the same table in the lamplight, the same voice in the dark. James ate his breakfast. Clara came down the hall at considerable volume. Raphael's song, he always sang at the morning work, carried through the kitchen window from the yard. Isaac sat at the table and looked at Anna over the rim of his coffee cup with the gray-green eyes that had not changed in the years since she first looked into them in the broken mirror of the Dusty Creek Saloon. And she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away, because they had stopped having any reason to. Outside, New Mexico was as old as time and as ordinary as morning, and inside the white adobe house with the deep western porch and the kitchen garden, and the bolt on the east room door that nobody needed anymore, a family went about the irreplaceable business of a good day, and the world continued on around them with its beauty and its difficulty and its perpetual insistence on the next thing, and they were ready for it, as they had always been ready for it together.